Thank you very much for having me. We'll dive right in as we talk about the changing patterns of care for babies with trisomy 13 and 18. Let's pretend you are seeing a patient at 26 weeks gestation. She's 37, it's her second pregnancy, and she has one healthy child at home. Trisomy 18 is confirmed at 22 weeks gestation. This baby is very small, has a very large VSD, cleft lip and palate, and a horseshoe kidney. If this mom leads with, we read a lot, we really don't want her to suffer, and we're thinking about things like comfort care. How many people would sigh, a big sigh of a relief? I'm gonna guess a lot. If this mom leads with, we read a lot, we really want her to survive, and we want to be in a place that would do heart surgery, how many people would feel the opposite of relief? A little bit agitated, maybe nervous. I suspect most of us would feel at least some degree of tension when faced with a request for full medical and surgical therapies for a baby with full trisomy 18. These are some of the well-known reasons why. Today, we don't have time to dive behind the data for each of these reasons, but I want to provide just a few very brief counterpoints and ask a few more clarifying questions to get us started. When we talk about suffering, is it physical or is it existential? Is it babies, families, or ours? When we say these are unreasonable hopes, I will just ask, whose hopes and what is unreasonable? When we say this baby is facing months to years in the hospital, I'd say that's probably true, but is it that different for kids with super severe BPD? When we say this care is very, very expensive, I'll say that's probably true. It's also not very common. But more importantly, there's no current framework to limit care for other high-intensity NICU care where the outcomes are not certain, like care for babies at 22 weeks gestation. When we say that this is medically futile, I'll push back pretty hard on this one. This is a flawed ethical construct. It's framed by the local outcomes. It's really in the eye of the person who is saying that, of the beholder. Lots has been published on family stress and sibling experience. These are two seminal papers highlighting that, presenting a pretty balanced view. It's not all bad. When we say poor long-term cognitive outcomes, that is probably true, though it depends on how you define poor. But the truth is that the ceiling of development in these kids is probably not more than 12 to 15 months, even in those who survive longer. However, there is a varied importance of this to parents, especially as we continue telling them that most of these kids will die within the first year of life. Clinicians' distress is really, really important. We can also change it. And to those who say these therapies are too novel, I would say, yeah, like everything else in our field at some point. We don't have time today to dive into all of the data concerning the long-term outcomes, but I wanted to share just a couple of these key points so that we have a shared framework as we're going forward. The first one is that the majority of these infants will still die within the first year of life. This is due to a combination of factors, such as the choice that parents make, therapies that are being offered versus not offered, and probably the phenotype. It's also why a choice to terminate a pregnancy or comfort care is still part of the options. Overall, there are higher rates of live-born births. Birth by C-section is incredibly common now, accounting for 60 to 70% of all live births. Unsurprisingly, with more therapies, there are more babies who survive longer, partly due because of the surgical trends that are rapidly increasing. And now we have an updated reported survival of about 40% to NICU discharge and 20 to 25% to 1 year. Conditional survival is also an important concept. That means that earlier survival signals the later survival. So knowing what we know about these outcomes, an important question to ask: who decides what is life-limiting? Is it the expert consensus or is it data? Because both can be moved with more therapies being offered. Or does a notion of a self-fulfilling prophecy play a part? Where not acting on a problem based on the prognosis has an ongoing impact on that prognosis. I want to expand on this last topic by borrowing from a different part of neonatology, care of babies at 22 to 23 weeks gestation. It seems that our care and sense of buy-in do in fact change depending on whether the baby in front of us is 22 weeks versus 23 weeks, as highlighted by this paper and many others. And as experts in the field once said, protocols do reflect values as well as facts, but values create facts, which means that how we feel about a certain problem will probably have an impact on what we do to solve it. Another big voice asks, in the NICU, do nurses, doctors, or parents spend more time with or pay more attention to infants they think will do well? Are they more careful with these infants? Are dozens daily small decisions made slightly differently for babies with a good prognosis versus bad ones? And do such decisions affect infant outcomes? I wonder if similar concepts can also be moved to the care of babies with trisomy 13 and 18. I suspect that some of you will shudder as you read the title of this paper and will question the sanity of this whole enterprise. But I assure you that lots of thought and intention and nuance is going into making these statements and asking these questions. And it's not a call to mandate or a law, but just a call to reconsider how we're thinking about this disease. A disclaimer moment. I'm not crazy enough to suggest that babies with trisomy 18 can go from a previously stated survival of less than 10% at a year to living for decades, like those born at 22 weeks gestation or those with trisomy 21. There's clearly a different ceiling here for the physiology. I'm merely suggesting that the incremental change is possible, given a slew of this emerging data, of which there's just no shortage lately. As one example, please consider this graph that shows a dramatic increase in the G-tube placements around 2012. It also shows a gradual uptick in tracheostomy placements and cardiac surgery around that time. But what happened in 2012? What happened is that a lot of the sort of seminal reports came out highlighting parental views on outcomes for babies who are surviving longer than a few months. Those reports also showed that there is a substantial cohort of babies that is living for years, not 1, but 3, 5, and 10 years. So it is plausible that those parental reports changed our practice, which then further changed the outcomes. It's also plausible to wonder if, given the spike in publication about cardiac surgery between 2015 and 2023, that the slope for cardiac surgery won't just continue to change, but it would grow just as dramatically as it did for G-tubes in 2012. We previously asked, who decides what is life-limiting? Who decides what is too new? What is, I guess, like an experiment? Some of the things on these slides are such, were probably such just a few years ago, but are much more normative today. And other things will remain the stuff of the future for quite some time now. But who knows for how long? And yes, this is hard. This is uncomfortable. It should feel uncomfortable, as this very thoughtful paper suggests, discussing treatments, sort of like at the frontiers of this type of medicine. We need not only buy-in from everybody involved, but also some guardrails to get off this path when it's the right thing to do so. These patients, like our patient here, go through a lot. And we are sometimes justified in wondering whether this pathway is the right one for them. And I'm not here to advocate for care for all babies with trisomy 13 and 18 in this way. I'm merely suggesting that care options may not be as limited as we previously decided they should be. And despite the obvious challenges, some parents are also justified to want a pathway that offers the ongoing hope for these kids to survive. So if more babies with these conditions survive in and outside of our NICUs, what should we do? I think we should start by supporting everybody through the ongoing uncertainty. Uncertainty is really hard for parents, but I would argue that it's actually harder for us. We're used to framing uncertainty as a negative, but I wonder if we could flip a little bit and at least sometimes think of it as a good thing. Perhaps uncertainty is linked to hope. Another thing to consider that all babies who survive with this condition will become survivors with chronic critical illness. We need to build sustainable care bridges from inpatient to outpatient, advocate for parents who do this work at home, and advocate on a local and the broader level. We also need to promote some culture change, not just in our NICUs, but in our fetal centers, our cardiac ICUs, our PICUs, as well as in our pediatricians and other pediatric subspecialists who are caring for these kids in the community. These are some of the thoughts on maybe how to move the needle on a local level. First, you bring all the stakeholders together, everybody who takes care of these families and kids. You agree that it's a good thing to try to change the outcomes. You start with some of the easy things first. Various screenings, some imaging with ultrasound, some bone health management, some pulmonary hypertension screening. You also agree that performing hearing screens in these kids is not a sliding slope towards ECMO. You start small and you don't always end big. You do the harder things next. Perhaps some early bronchs, surgical procedures like G-tubes, spina bifida closure, just for the ease of care and comfort. You do hardest things last, and definitely all together. Tracheostomy decisions, cardiac caths, CV surgical repairs, and liver tumor resections. You also agree and signal to other teams that each problem should be met with talking about a solution and not with a goals of care conversation. Sometimes a fracture is just a fracture and should lead to better bone health and not to talking about a code status change, as is still so common in this patient group. And speaking of hardest things like CV surgery, lots of published data between 2018 and 2023 point towards more surgical care, much better surgical outcomes than previously thought, and a very nuanced conversation about burdens, benefits, and policies in the sphere of medicine. As one example, consider this multi-database study that's looking at cardiac surgical outcomes from 45 hospitals. You can see that survival of babies with trisomy 13 post-cardiac surgery was 53% and was 61% for those with trisomy 18. Of note, most surgeries were complete cardiac repairs. Many patients were much younger than previously thought, and that is now becoming a trend. And many already had a G-tube and a tracheostomy heading into surgery. And when you read this most recent and comprehensive consensus statement from CV surgery, you will see statements that it is reasonable to offer cardiac repair for babies with trisomy 18 with mild to moderate severity of illness, while it might not be reasonable to do so with highly complex severity of illness or single ventricle disease. It goes further to state that for those patients who are mechanically ventilated heading into CV surgery, it's also reasonable to talk about a possible tracheostomy as part of the preoperative counseling. Which brings me to my next point. In this era of more therapies, added nuance is really key. Some decisions should be easily uncoupled from one another, such as a decision about a mode of delivery and then postnatal therapies, or trial of CPAP and trach. One can exist without the other, and one does not flow from the other. While other things should be more closely coupled with full transparency for parents and medical teams. For example, if the family is considering cardiac surgical repair in a baby with chronic respiratory failure, they should be counseled that accepting a possibility of a tracheostomy in a G-tube is like part of a package. Some of us may kind of bristle at that, but we have to acknowledge the very complicated balance of taking on higher risk surgical patients, of reporting of surgical outcomes, and maintaining the health of the heart center as guided by those outcomes and all the other patients they serve. So all efforts should be made to turn these kids into long-term survivors after cardiac surgery, even if that means using more medical technology and sometimes surgery to do so. Most parents kind of know and also want this, but I think we just have to be much more clear as we talk about these interventions. So nothing should be black and white. It might be easier to use these sort of like verbal shorthands to describe a story, but it's probably best not to do so. Some highly technological and even surgical things can also be palliative in nature, especially if you consider symptom management as part of that. Chronic mechanical ventilation or VSD closure can help with dyspnea, can improve sleep and state regulation, can definitely improve growth, and perhaps can help that child reach whatever developmental potential that they were always meant to reach. Yes, some things are scary and unpredictable, like they were for our patients from a previous slide, who was also born at 34 weeks gestation. Of note, preterm birth, as coupled with this condition, is the single biggest predictor of death. He was in our hospital for over a year, was mechanically ventilated that entire time, had several code events, had 2 heart surgeries, a G-tube and a Nissen, and he had a liver cancer that we also treated. He's home now. His pathway forward is not fully guaranteed, but he has more good days than bad. Would it have been better if he died shortly after birth? And better for whom? Who should ask that question? And more importantly, who should answer it? My strong personal bias that it should be his parents with us as guide and not this other way around. Whenever these moral ethical tensions bubble up to the surface, I find it helpful to encourage clinicians to ask themselves and others some of these questions. Is this the sickest patient in my unit? The answer is usually no. Why do I feel the way that I do about them? What do I know about the outcomes beyond my unit's outcome? Who would be hurt if we tried to have this baby survive? Why does the family want what they want? Am I influenced by how others feel? And other factors that influence how I feel, such as insurance status, cost of care perhaps, the length of stay considerations or pressures, something about the parents. And speaking of the parental factors, let's flip the script for just 1 second. Remember, this was our patient from the beginning of the talk. She's 37, it's her second pregnancy, she has 1 child, and she is married. What if it was this patient who's 18, it's her first pregnancy, she's single, she left high school, she lives in a tiny town that's 3 hours away from a major pediatric hospital. And what if this was our patient? 43, 3rd pregnancy, multiple rounds of IVF, she already lost a child, and she's a lawyer. It is reasonable and honest to acknowledge that many societal and social factors go into how we tell the story and how we feel about the story. As I was preparing this talk, I was struggling a bit with whether to talk about this part. Do politics belong in medicine? Sometimes and sometimes not. But this part of medicine, care of babies with life-limiting conditions, is becoming more and more touched by politics and policy. So I wanted to spend just a few very brief minutes asking a few tough questions if we're thinking of changing this triangle of care in any direction. First one, if more babies with this condition survive, would it no longer be considered a life-limiting condition that currently justifies pregnancy termination in states where it is currently banned? Would we offer different postnatal choices, perhaps even those not in the best interest of the baby, to women who wanted to terminate the pregnancy but couldn't? Should we assume that perinatal hospice becomes the default pathway for those who wanted to end the pregnancy but couldn't? Or should we assume that more of those kids will actually end up with us because their parents choose an ICU care? And will we judge those parents even harsher for choosing things like tracheostomy and heart surgery, knowing that they once wanted something very different? If more babies with this condition survive and their parents want to take them home with hospice, pediatric hospice is a limited resource. What are we going to do about that? Lastly, in this era of new therapies, it's important to hear from parents who are choosing something very different. They don't really contribute that much to the literature. You can make any data sing, as you all know, and the song that's currently the loudest is about the babies who are surviving. It's important to hear from all parents, even the ones who are making a different choice, and I look forward to a little bit more, of a balance in that conversation. It's a complicated dialogue, and everybody who takes care of these kids should be, at least to a degree, a part of it together. I leave you with this. This is Lindley. She was in our hospital for about 8 months. She was ventilated for about 4 out of those 8. She had 2 heart surgeries, a G-tube and a Nissen. At some point, we were pretty convinced that she's heading towards a trach and a home vent, but time and her mom convinced us otherwise. She's been home for about 2 months now, did well through her first cold, and is enjoying whatever time she has at home. We pushed the envelope, we got a few things wrong, we learned a lot, and we'll be better next time. I'm not certain of many things in life, but I'm certain this kid is probably not suffering at home. Despite all that, it was not always easy for Lindley, her family, or us, but this is challenging and great work, and that just suggests that you consider doing that for your patients, your teams, and then for everybody that follows. Thank you for your time.